Africa is a continent with boundless potential. It has the natural resources, the population, and the landmass to become a major player on the global stage. Why then is the gap between Africa and the rest of the world increasing? What needs to be done to unleash Africa's potential and ignite a growth revolution? And how does crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic further affect the continent's future prospects? To provide insight into these questions, Optentia at the Northwest University turned to an author and expert analyst on regional affairs. Dr. Jakkie Cilliers is the founder and current chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Security Studies. Due to lockdown restrictions, he shared his insights with Optentia researchers during a recent teleconference.
There is no single magic bullet to Africa's development. Africa has to pay attention to all of these fundamental concerns of growth.
In his latest book, he examines where the African continent is at and where it will be in 2040 if it continues along its current path. According to Dr. Cilliers, it is possible for the 55 countries on the continent to catch up with the rest of the world, although it will require a large measure of leapfrogging.
So leapfrogging is the use of digital technology, the fourth industrial revolution, to move more rapidly through the industrial processes that we've seen in the past. In the book, I use an uncommon approach to leapfrogging. I basically say that what leapfrogging can do is it can help Africa to much more rapidly formalize the informal sector. The best example that is often quoted is what's happened with mobile phone technology, M-Pesa and so on in Kenya, where financial transactions have all become digitized, and that allows the farmer in a rural area to get connected, to get access to credit, also to use modern technology to be able to access where he should sell his goods. And that is a way, leapfrogging, in which Africa can advance more rapidly. And Africa has huge potential to leapfrog. I have used the relationship of working age people to dependence as the way I explain the demographic dividend. I showed you a population pyramid. Another way of looking at the demographic dividend is to look at median age. Countries get to their demographic dividend when their median age is about 25 or 26 years of age. Two examples of countries that have done particularly well through the demographic dividend. The one is the examples of China and the Asian tigers. They have had a very rapid demographic dividend, which have propelled them to amazing high levels of growth. The other group of countries are countries like Sweden, the United States, and many of the European countries who have remained in a positive relationship in the case of the United States, for almost 100 years. So they have had a benefited from a demographic dividend of 1.7 working age people to dependents for almost a century. It's no wonder that these are the rich countries in the world. The average median age in much of Africa is below 20. So to reiterate, Africa on average only gets to its demographic dividend after 2050. After 2050, the relationship of working age people to dependents starts to improve. Your population pyramid now starts to look like the Taj Mahal. It's got a bulge around the middle. And that means that the ratio of working age people to dependents is increasing. That means that labor becomes a larger contributor to economic growth. 30 years from now, if all things are equal, Africa really gets to that demographic dividend. There are countries that are going more rapidly through this. Government policy, empowerment of women, access to modern contraceptives, these are all important. None of that happens without political leadership. If you want people to have a fight, then you speak about the contrast between growth and inequality. And because there, of course, is never a clear choice, because you have to deal with inequality, you have to deal with growth. But the longer your forecast horizon, the more important growth becomes. Eventually, over longer term horizons, more rapid economic growth eventually outpaces everything else, including reductions in inequality, on eventually improving livelihoods. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world if you use the Gini coefficient. And Southern Africa is in actual fact more unequal than any other region globally. The informal sector in Southern Africa is smaller than in the rest of Africa. And one of the reasons why the informal sector is small is because you have a particular orientation to growth that comes from the ideological orientation from the ruling parties. These are all countries that are governed by former liberation parties, the ANC, SWAPO, ZANU-PF, Frelimo, CHOA, and they have an orientation to growth, which is a very sort of a top-down, state-led development model. It does not provide for the kind of innovation that you would see in East Africa, for example. Sustainable income growth comes only from employment growth in the formal sector. The informal sector is a sponge or a cushion. It helps to make sure that people are not entirely and fully destitute. If you want to grow an economy, eventually you have to grow employment in the formal sector. You have to grow the formal sector of the economy and lock people into formal employment where they are guaranteed annual wage improvements, they have the social protection, and so on. The impact of COVID-19 on Africa is still very uncertain. The IMF says that what is going to happen is that the world is going to have a sharp V-shaped recession with a recovery in 2021. So Africa goes from 2.6% growth to minus 3% growth in 2020 and then rebounds. And on that scenario, which is a very positive scenario, Africa's GDP will be about $170 billion smaller in 2020 than we would otherwise have forecast. Average incomes will be about $160 per person less, and 11 million more Africans will be extremely poor. Because of Africa's very young population and the uncertainties about comorbidity, we really just don't know. But generally the expectation is that COVID will probably have lower mortality rates than elsewhere in the world, largely because of our much younger population. The impact of continued efforts at flattening the curve means that invariably many more Africans will die of hunger. And these are the kind of things that we have to think about in terms of responding to COVID. And that means moving to systems of collective isolation. Now, it may sound a bit of a contradiction in terms, where communities and areas rather try and, in a sense, police themselves, but you allow economic and other activity within those areas to resume. It's a huge challenge for Africa. There is no single magic bullet to Africa's development. Africa has to pay attention to all of these fundamental concerns of growth. Namibia and South Africa don't really have a problem. We are in a demographic sweet spot, but we are not growing because the government policies and the private sector are not playing an appropriate role in allowing that growth. The demographic dividend on its own does not guarantee growth. It makes a small contribution. You have to invest in appropriate education, make sure that government policies facilitate the provision of an agricultural sector so that you can feed your own people, that you have a healthy workforce, and so on and so forth. So all these things go together. And the summary of Africa First is really just a summary of all the issues that have to be dealt with across all the various dimensions. So what I've tried to do in Africa First is is not to take a single approach to one issue, but to try and deal with all of the various efforts from governance to democracy, sort of a serious attempt at trying to look at the broad scope of all the issues that Africa have to deal with.